Hey there, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. If you're here to unwind, doze off, or simply let your mind drift into the past, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're journeying deep into the Roman Empire, not through the grand halls of emperors or the blood-soaked arenas of gladiators, but into the worn sandals of the people who kept the whole machine running, the slaves. We're going to gently explore how Roman slaves survived the brutal labour that defined their lives, how they endured it, how they found rhythms within it, and how they sometimes carved out quiet moments of humanity within a system designed to dehumanize, from the humid kitchens of elite Roman villas to the dusty work gangs of the countryside, from domestic servitude to the terrifying labour in mines and mills. This is a tale not of glory, but of survival, not of heroes, but of countless, nameless individuals who carried the weight of an empire one day at a time. So, find a comfortable position, relax your shoulders, and let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we begin a journey into the quiet strength, endurance, and muted resilience of those who lived in the shadows of ancient Rome. And if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe and settle in, because the past is waiting and it has much to share, slowly and softly as we begin our story. Imagine the first light of dawn casting a dim golden glow across the sprawling Roman countryside. The fields stretch into the distance, dotted with olive trees, vineyards, and endless rows of wheat. A chill clings to the morning air, heavy with dew and the faint scent of damp soil. Somewhere in the haze of early day, a soft rustle marks the first stirrings of life. Slaves rising from straw-stuffed mats, already bracing for another long day beneath the imperial sun. For many Roman slaves, the day began not with the luxury of time, but with the sharp sound of commands. Overseers would call them to rise well before the sun fully crested the hills. In the countryside, particularly on large agricultural estates known as latifundia, slaves lived in barrack-like quarters, often cramped, dark, and cold. These were not homes but holding spaces, designed more for efficiency than comfort. Most of these slaves had been captured in war or purchased through Rome's extensive trade networks, funneled into the empire from distant lands: Gaul, Germania, Thrace, Africa, the East. The languages spoken among them were diverse, but the rhythm of their days was the same: wake, work, sleep, repeat. Once roused, the labour began almost immediately. Farm slaves tended to the vineyards and fields, often working from dawn until dusk under the unblinking eye of the overseer. Their tasks changed with the seasons, pruning vines in the winter, harvesting in the autumn, planting in the spring. In summer, the days grew long, the heat unrelenting. Skin burned and backs ached, but the work never ceased. Meals were simple and sparse. A bit of pulse, a porridge made of barley or other grains, perhaps a piece of bread or a few olives, maybe some diluted wine. Meat was rare. Luxury was unheard of. Meals were taken quickly, in silence, and often while still standing or squatting on the edge of a field. Within this hard routine, the slaves' lives were not entirely without variation. Some worked in the villas of their masters, performing domestic tasks. These slaves fared slightly better in terms of shelter and diet, but they too were bound by duty from sunup to sundown. They cleaned, cooked, tended fires, served guests, dressed their masters, and cared for children who were not their own. For many their names were forgotten, replaced by titles or roles. And yet, even in this rigid structure, there were rhythms that soothed. The gentle scraping of hoes against soil, the low murmur of fellow workers passing time in murmured conversation, the rustle of olive branches in the wind. These moments were not freedom, but they were breath. In the urban centres, life was different, but not necessarily easier. Slaves there might work in workshops, mills, public baths, or for the state. Some were employed by tradesmen, becoming skilled in crafts like pottery, metalwork, or weaving. A few were even teachers or accountants if they had the education. These were still slaves, but they had tasks that sometimes engaged the mind, a rare luxury in the hierarchy of labour. Daily life in Roman slavery was not only defined by physical toil, but also by a constant awareness of hierarchy. There were layers even among slaves. House slaves sometimes lorded over field slaves. Greek slaves were often considered more refined than others. A slave born into the household might be seen as more trustworthy than one who had been purchased. Punishment was a constant shadow. The lash of the whip was a familiar sound. Mistakes, perceived laziness, or even bad luck could draw the wrath of an overseer or master. These punishments were not always brutal, but they were always reminders. Reminders of ownership, of control, of one's place in the great Roman order. But beyond the pain and the repetition, there were quiet acts of resilience. A slave who hummed softly while grinding grain, bringing rhythm to a monotonous chore. Another who passed along old stories from their homeland, whispered at night when the overseers slept. Or one who learned to bake bread just right, gaining a tiny measure of favour, and perhaps a moment of ease. Imagine a small kitchen tucked behind a Roman villa. The hearth glows faintly as dawn breaks. A young girl, perhaps no older than 12, rises before her master's children. She wipes the sleep from her eyes and begins kneading dough for the morning meal. Her hands are small but practised. This is her daily rhythm. Wake, knead, wait, serve. Sometimes she hums, though she doesn't know the words. They're fragments of something remembered, something softer. In another part of the empire, in the vast mines of Sardinia, a boy no older than that girl is lowered into the dark. He grips a tiny oil lamp, no bigger than a fist, its flickering light the only warmth he will know for hours. He works in near silence, chipping at the rock face day after day. He's been here since he was small. His back is already stooped. As we linger in the slower rhythms of Roman slave life, imagine the subtle choreography of a morning in the Villa Rustica, the rural Roman estate. Long before the master stirred, the household slaves had already begun their movements. A flick of the wrist to ignite a lamp, the whisper of fabric as garments were folded, the dull thud of water jars being filled from a nearby well. This was the domain of the domestic slave. Unlike those in the fields, their toil was marked not by sweat beneath the sun, but by constant motion in the shadow of another's life. Each task had its place, each step its consequence. The servant who prepared breakfast for the Dominus needed to anticipate his mood, ensure the bread was warm, the wine just so. A misstep, a forgotten item could draw a glance, a word, or something sharper. Many of these domestic slaves had been born into the household. Known as verni, they were raised among the rhythms of Roman life and spoke Latin with fluency, though often not as their first tongue. Despite this proximity to their masters, they were rarely close. Trust was conditional. Affection, if present, was laced with control. In the great cities, Rome, Ostia, Carthage, slaves navigated streets thick with noise and commerce. Those assigned to errands moved through crowds with practised swiftness. Bread from the market, oil for the lamps, letters to be delivered. They were seen, and yet unseen. Familiar fixtures in an empire built on their labour. Some bore markings, collars with inscriptions such as, "Hold me if I try to run," etched in bronze. Others wore plain tunics, indistinct from the poor freemen. But they all knew the weight of obedience. In every step there was awareness of hierarchy. Labour was constant, but it was not mindless. A cook's apprentice might learn the subtle balance of spice and smoke. a seamstress could develop an eye for fine needlework. These were skills that had no ownership, yet they belonged for now to someone else. Still, in these details, some found slivers of pride, not freedom, but presence. In the afternoons, when the sun was high, many slaves took brief rest. Meals, if permitted, were taken then. A small bowl of lentils, a piece of bread softened in wine. Conversation, when it occurred, was hushed and cautious. News passed between them, of crops, of punishments, of whispered rumours from the forum. Some managed tiny gestures of resistance, though rarely openly. A job done slowly, a task forgotten, a moment taken to stretch sore muscles when no one was watching. These were not acts of rebellion, but of survival. Quiet declarations that one's body, even in bondage, still moved by its own will. Festivals brought rare variation. Saturnalia, for example, was a strange inversion, when masters might serve their slaves and laughter filled the halls. For a moment, lines blurred, but even this was performance. Come morning, the hierarchy returned, more rigid than before. Religious observance provided another layer of life. Slaves might pray to household gods, the Lares and Penates, or to deities of their own traditions, imported from Nubia, Syria, Thrace. These prayers were often private, folded into routines, lighting a lamp, whispering over water, scratching symbols into hidden corners of stone. Though stripped of autonomy, many found solace in shared routines. The sharpening of tools, the folding of linen, the tending of coals, these were rituals in their own right, a way to mark time, to remain tethered to the world. And through it all, relationships formed. Bonds between fellow slaves, often deeper than those of blood. They protected each other, whispered comforts, shared fragments of memory. Within the confines of oppression, community became a form of defence. Even joy, brief, cautious, flickering, could be found in a shared joke, a song half remembered, a glance that said, "I see you." Not all masters were cruel. Some offered privileges, a better meal, lighter duties, the hope of manumission. Others were unpredictable, ruling with whim or silence. The unpredictability itself was its own form of control. Slaves lived in a state of alertness, always anticipating what came next. Among the elite, it was fashionable to have educated slaves, tutors for children, scribes for correspondence, even philosophers or physicians. These individuals occupied a strange space, respected for their intellect, yet still property. A slave who could quote Homer or diagnose an ailment was still subject to punishment, to sale, to separation from family. And there were families. Slaves fell in love. They married in their own way, often without legal recognition. They bore children. These unions, tender and hopeful, existed beneath the constant fear of separation. A mother might wake to find her child sold to another household, a husband reassigned, a wife dismissed. Love endured, but rarely unbroken. As the Roman sun continues its arc across the sky, casting long shadows across fields and courtyards alike, we drift closer to the moments that rarely made it into records, the quiet reclaiming of humanity by those who were denied it. In the stillness of routine, Roman slaves often created pockets of identity. These small cultural spaces, formed in shared language, gestures, habits, offered structure and belonging. Even when their bodies were owned, their minds remained landscapes of memory, belief, and quiet resilience. Slaves from similar regions often clustered together when possible. Thracians, Syrians, Gauls. They brought with them fragments of their homeland. Songs hummed while weaving, patterns etched into clay vessels, spices added to simple stews. Though Roman life attempted to erase difference, cultural fingerprints remained. Language was a lifeline. Latin was the tongue of labour, but native dialects lingered. A whispered phrase, a familiar rhythm of speech became a bond. Even among the youngest, Verni, whose first words were often Latin, echoes of their parents' speech shaped how they thought, how they prayed, how they dreamed. Some crafted small icons, figures of old gods fashioned from clay or carved wood. These weren't always hidden. Sometimes they sat beside Roman lares, a quiet nod to the coexistence of multiple worlds. A household might outwardly follow Roman rites, yet within its walls, a slave might light a candle for Isis, or leave grain for a Celtic goddess of the hearth. Music too was a salve. Instruments made from reeds or bone, the human voice lifted in melody. These were tools of continuity. Lullabies once sung in distant valleys now whispered in Roman kitchens. Work songs softened the ache of repetition. Rhythmic clapping, humming, or call and response games helped sustain morale. Imagine the sound of a rhythmic tapping on stone, perhaps a pestle against mortar. It starts slow, then steadies. Across the kitchen another joins in. A voice hums a phrase from memory. It is not rebellion, not resistance in the overt sense, but it is a moment reclaimed. In larger households, some slaves organised informal gatherings after nightfall. These moments were brief, fleeting, a shared bowl of food, a story told in the half-light. These spaces allowed for laughter, for sadness, for remembering, for being more than a tool. Children born into slavery often inherited a patchwork identity. They learned Roman customs through proximity, but absorbed ancestral traditions through stories, rituals, and kitchen aromas. An old lullaby might carry the cadence of Nubia. A charm whispered against illness might be traced to the forests of Germania. In them, the world's borders blurred. Storytelling was another thread. Myths from homelands were passed down, reshaped, woven into the Roman backdrop. Legends of distant mountains, rivers that sang, gods who watched over fields. These weren't just tales, they were anchors. Ways of saying, we existed before this. We exist still. Even within the harshest environments, mines, mills, construction crews, slaves developed signs, gestures, and unspoken codes to navigate danger and offer help. A glance that meant, step back. A phrase that warned of an overseer's approach. This underground language was born of necessity, but it formed its own quiet society. Occasionally, in moments when the burdens of the day lifted slightly, creativity emerged. A bit of poetry etched into a wall, a necklace made from scraps, a drawing in the dust. Art, even the humblest kind, was an act of defiance against oblivion. A whisper, I am here. Slaves who worked in urban environments, especially those connected to trades, sometimes passed skills to one another. The weaver might teach patterns. The carpenter might show a younger slave how to plane wood. These apprenticeships weren't official, but they carried value. In a world that stripped away titles, knowledge was a form of dignity. Some slaves even wrote, especially those trained as scribes or copyists. A few short messages survive, scratched onto walls or pottery, brief, poignant and human. Notes of longing, names remembered, a joke, a curse, a blessing. These fragments are voices reaching through time, soft yet clear. Among these cultures of the enslaved, rules developed, agreements about sharing food, guarding secrets, offering comfort. These informal codes gave a semblance of order, even justice, within a system built on domination. Imagine a small group gathered in a servant's courtyard. The master's family is away for the evening. The fire is low, flickering against stone. A young man is retelling a story his grandmother once told him, long before he was brought to Rome. It's a tale of a fox and a river. funny, sharp, full of wisdom. Around him, a few heads nod. Someone laughs quietly. For a moment, there is warmth. As the final shadows of dusk settle over the Roman world, we turn our attention to something even more delicate than resistance: agency. Not the grand gestures of revolt or escape, but the small decisions made within tightly confined boundaries. The places where the enslaved found moments of choice, however limited, and used them to shape their lives. The Roman system, vast and methodical, was designed to suppress autonomy. Yet, cracks existed. Within those cracks, individual acts of will emerged. A slave who chose to teach another to read, though forbidden. One who memorized household schedules and used that knowledge to take a few extra minutes of rest. A woman who hid a cherished object beneath her sleeping mat, unseen by all. These were not freedoms in any political sense. They did not dismantle the structure, but they mattered. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was one such complex space. Some slaves were promised freedom after years of service. Others could buy their way out, saving small tips or gifts from their masters. The process was bureaucratic and unpredictable, yet it existed, and with it, the glimmer of possibility. A freed slave, known as a libertus or liberta, still bore many limitations. They owed duties to their former masters and could not hold high office. Yet they could marry legally, own property, and pass down wealth. Their children, remarkably, were considered full Roman citizens. In this, a door, narrow and heavily guarded, opened into the world. This possibility influenced behaviour. A slave hoping for manumission might work with greater care. They might try to curry favour, to demonstrate loyalty. It was not always effective, but it was a strategy. And strategies, however quiet, are signs of agency. Sometimes masters allowed slaves to form quasi-familial structures. Couples lived together as husband and wife. Children, while still enslaved, remained with their parents. These arrangements could be disrupted at any time, but while they lasted, they provided meaning. The act of nurturing a child, of preparing food for someone loved, of holding a hand in grief, these too were expressions of self. In workshops, particularly in urban settings, slaves sometimes managed operations. A trusted slave, called an actor, might handle money, negotiate deals, oversee others. They became intermediaries, still bound yet empowered. Their competence became indispensable, a fragile form of leverage. There were slaves who performed in public, the actors, dancers, musicians, and even gladiators. Their lives were paradoxical, on display yet caged, celebrated yet controlled. And in their performances they navigated expectations. A gesture too bold might offend, too meek, and they were forgotten. Each movement had weight. Education was another sliver of light. Literate slaves were rare but valuable. They copied manuscripts, kept records, read aloud for their masters. Knowledge, in this world, was both tool and chain. It bound them to complex roles, but also gave them a voice few others possessed. Among the most remarkable were the pedagogi, slaves who educated Roman children. Often Greek, often well-read, they shaped the minds of future elites while remaining property themselves. Their presence in a household was profound, and while their own pasts were muted, their ideas lived on in the pupils they guided. Imagine a quiet room in a Roman townhouse. A young boy struggles with his Latin conjugations. His tutor, an older Greek man with a furrowed brow, corrects him gently. The boy sighs. The tutor smiles faintly. For a moment, they are simply teacher and student. The fact that one wears chains is invisible, but never absent. Beyond these roles, there were also economies of kindness. A slave might share an extra bit of food with a friend. One might help a sick elder, even if it meant more work. These decisions, though small, created networks of care that transcended the cold logic of slavery. Some slaves became known for specific skills: a cook whose meals were subtly better, a cleaner who left no trace of dust, a healer with herbal knowledge. These reputations passed from mouth to mouth, created informal currencies, a favour owed, a name remembered. And sometimes there were moments of open speech, a joke told at the right time, a truth whispered too loud. These utterances, while risky, reminded everyone that within each body labelled service was a voice, a mind, a will. Even death did not erase agency entirely. Some slaves, if favoured, were buried with markers, small tombstones noting their names, roles, and sometimes sentiments. To Lucius, a faithful servant. To Tertia, who worked in the kitchen and was loved. These fragments are not grand, but they are testimonies, proof that someone lived, laboured, and was remembered. In the vast silence of ancient history, few individual stories of slaves in the Roman Empire survived the erosion of time. Names were rarely recorded, deeds went unnoticed, and yet scattered across the centuries are fragments, moments, inscriptions, and whispered records that let us glimpse a life once lived. In this segment, we gently trace the outline of one such figure, Tiro, the loyal and literate slave of the famed Roman orator Marcus Tullius Cicero. Tiro was no ordinary servant. He was born into slavery, likely around 103 BCE, in the household of Cicero, or acquired very early in life. From the start, his role was not one of field labour or brute force, but of intellect and precision. He was trained as a secretarius, or private secretary. His task? To assist in the daily affairs, correspondence, and intellectual life of one of Rome's greatest statesmen. Imagine a quiet study at dawn, scrolls stacked high on low wooden shelves, the faint smell of ink and oil lamps lingering in the air. Tiro, still a young man, prepares Cicero's writing materials, reeds carefully sharpened, wax tablets smoothed, parchment unrolled. When Cicero dictated, it was Tiro who recorded his words, who structured his thoughts, who ensured that the machinery of rhetoric continued to turn. He developed his own system of shorthand, an early form of stenography that would one day bear his name, Notae Tironianae. It allowed him to keep pace with Cicero's rapid thoughts, capturing speeches and debates with remarkable fidelity. This system, a subtle yet revolutionary tool, enabled the preservation of orations that might otherwise have vanished. But Tiro's role extended beyond transcription. He managed letters, sometimes composing them himself, communicated with political allies, and handled the practical aspects of Cicero's busy life. He was in many ways a partner in thought, a facilitator of brilliance, and yet he was still a slave. Tiro lived in a world where his talents, his loyalty, and even his innovations belonged not to himself but to another. The credit for speeches, for political manoeuvrings, for philosophical insights belonged to Cicero. Tiro's name, though occasionally mentioned, was a shadow at the edge of legacy. Despite this, there are signs that their relationship was marked by trust, and perhaps a form of mutual respect. Cicero eventually granted Tiro his freedom, likely in the 50s BCE, when Tiro was already a middle-aged man. In doing so, he elevated Tiro to the status of libertus, and with that came not only freedom but a certain degree of honour. As a freedman, Tiro continued to serve Cicero. Their bond did not dissolve with manumission. Instead, it evolved. Tiro remained at Cicero's side through political upheaval, exile, and personal loss. He travelled with him, recorded his correspondence, and preserved the structure of his life amid Rome's chaos. Consider the texture of Tiro's days: diplomatic dispatches to draft, visiting senators to greet, speeches to prepare for performance in the Senate, and through it all, a quiet presence, alert and steady, bearing the pressure of high politics from behind the curtain. Tiro's influence may have been greater than we know. Some believe he helped compile and edit Cicero's letters after his death, documents that remain a primary source for understanding Roman political life. His shorthand system laid the foundation for future methods of transcription, influencing clerical traditions for centuries. He lived well into old age, a rarity in any era, especially for those born into bondage. After Cicero's assassination in 43 BCE, Tiro devoted himself to organising his master's papers. His efforts preserved not just words, but ideas, records of a republic in turmoil, of eloquence under siege, of hope shaded by fatalism. But let us turn away from public record for a moment. Imagine Tiro in his later years. A small villa, perhaps modest but comfortable, shelves lined with scrolls, a garden where he walks in the early morning light. He reflects on the man he served, on the wars he witnessed, on the freedom he earned. Perhaps he still writes. Perhaps he teaches a younger freedman the notes he once devised, the shorthand that once kept pace with a mind moving too fast for ink. What remains of him is faint. A few mentions in letters, fragments of a biography he may have written about Cicero, and the echo of a name attached to a system of writing. But through these echoes, we feel something larger. Tiro's life, though exceptional in its proximity to power, was still shaped by the contours of enslavement. He used his mind to navigate those limits. He carved space for himself within a structure that rarely allowed it. And in doing so, he preserved history, not just Cicero's, but his own. As we drift further into the subtle shadows of Roman memory, we find ourselves standing before rows of ancient stone. In quiet necropolises along the outskirts of cities like Rome, Ostia, and Pompeii lie the resting places of people whose voices were rarely heard in life but faintly preserved in death. Among them are the inscriptions of slaves and freedmen, modest, poignant, and profoundly human. These funerary inscriptions, carved into humble headstones, are small acts of remembrance. They do not shout. They whisper. They do not tell of conquest or glory. Instead, they speak of love, duty, memory, and loss. In these stones we find the echoes of lives lived quietly, often painfully, but with an enduring will to be remembered. Imagine walking a dusty Roman road and pausing before a weathered tombstone. The Latin is simple, the letters uneven, but the message is clear. To Faustus, slave of Lucius, who lived 25 years, a good and faithful servant, his companion Julia placed this stone. The name Faustus means fortunate. Whether ironic or sincere, we can only guess. But what stands out is Julia. Perhaps a fellow slave, perhaps more. She remembered him. She marked his place. She ensured he would not be forgotten. Such inscriptions were often funded by companions, family, or former masters. They reflect not only identity but relationships. Even within the confines of slavery, bonds formed. People loved, mourned, and commemorated one another. Another reads, "To Philadelphus, freedman of Publius, who served faithfully." His wife Severa laid this in sorrow. Here the term freedman indicates that Philadelphus had once been enslaved but had gained his freedom. His wife's name, Severa, suggests dignity, gravity. Her act of remembrance is quiet but weighty. It tells us of partnership, of shared life, of grief that transcends status. These epitaphs often include the phrase benemerenti, well-deserving. This was a formula, yes, but also a statement of character. It conveyed that the deceased had lived with dignity, even under constraint. It offered a kind of moral freedom, if not a legal one. Consider, to Auctus, slave of Gaius, aged 19, He was sweet-natured and clever, loved by all. The mention of personality, sweet-natured and clever, invites us closer. Orctus is no longer just a role, he is a person. Perhaps he brought laughter to his household. Perhaps his cleverness saved others from punishment. We can only wonder. In other cases, inscriptions reveal sorrowful partings. To Flora, taken too soon, a girl of grace and joy, beloved by her mistress, who placed this in memory. Here, affection is suggested. Whether genuine or ritualized, the sentiment speaks volumes. Even in a hierarchical world, moments of closeness existed, sometimes fraught, sometimes tender. The physical placement of these tombs is also telling. Many were located along roads outside city gates. This was the Roman tradition, keeping the dead close to the living. As people walked to and from the city, they passed reminders of lives now gone. The messages were meant to be read, to provoke memory, to make the forgotten visible, even briefly. Some inscriptions include occupations. One might find, to Hermes, slave and baker, who served at the Forum. This tells us more than just a job. The Forum was a centre of public life. Hermes moved among it, perhaps selling bread, perhaps rising early to knead dough in the chill before dawn. His role placed him in the heart of the city, yet his status kept him at its margins. Others hint at pride in labour. To Hilarus, cobbler and freedman, who taught his son the trade. There's something quietly powerful here. A father, once a slave, now teaching his child. A trade passed down. A future shaped not by bondage, but by skill. Some tombstones are bilingual, reflecting the diversity of Rome. A name in Latin, followed by a phrase in Greek or Punic. These suggest layered identities, slaves who lived between cultures, who navigated multiple worlds. Occasionally, inscriptions break from convention. They include jokes, riddles, even light curses. One reads, "Stop, traveller, and read. I was a slave, then a freedman. Now I rest. Don't envy me. I no longer work." A dry wit preserved in stone. It's a reminder that humour survived, even thrived, among those who had little control over their lives. It was a way to cope, to claim the last word. In some cases, inscriptions reveal the pain of separation. To Dharma and Follicula, children of the household, taken by fever, their mother weeps, though her tears change nothing. Were these children of slaves, or slaves themselves called children by a kind mistress? The ambiguity is haunting, but the emotion is clear. As we move through these fragments, patterns emerge. A yearning for recognition, a wish to be remembered, a desire for connection, even in death. Imagine a young freed woman holding a small bundle of coins, standing before a stonemason. Beyond the stone and silence of epitaphs lies another layer of memory, one far less formal but equally revealing. In this next chapter of our gentle journey through the lives of enslaved Romans, we step into kitchens, workshops, bedrooms and alleyways. Here, history is preserved not in grand monuments, but in crumbs, scratches, wear patterns and forgotten tools. We turn to the archaeology of the intimate, the things people touched, used, lost and left behind. Archaeology, in its softest form, is the study of lives by what they carried. And for Roman slaves, these remnants tell stories of proximity, labour, endurance, and even joy. Let's begin in the kitchens of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other preserved Roman towns. Volcanic ash, though catastrophic, sealed entire households in stasis. In these places, we find mortars still filled with grain, loaves of bread carbonized mid-bake, bronze pots hanging by their handles, ready to be lifted again. The tools of cooking were often handled by slaves. And in these quiet remnants we sense their presence, not in portraits, but in calloused palms and scorched fingertips. One corner of a Pompeian villa reveals a small side room just off the kitchen, a narrow space with a low ceiling, furnished with a straw mat, a crude shelf, and a single lamp niche in the wall. This, archaeologists suggest, was a slave's quarters. There is no grandeur here, but there is structure, a place for sleep, a place to place one's belongings, however meagre. Graffiti scratched into plastered walls often speaks more candidly than any inscription. In servant corridors and stairwells, brief etchings offer us names, drawings, even jokes. Some are simple. Felix cooked this bread. It was good. Others are poignant. I miss Gaia. And some are irreverent. Cato smells worse than the fish sauce. These markings are not rebellion. They are recognition, proof that someone lived here, worked here, thought here. Even in anonymity there is humanity. Graffiti isn't always about complaint or humour. Some is artistic. In a small room in a villa near the Bay of Naples, a wall bears a childlike drawing. Two figures holding hands beneath a tree. The lines are uneven, the perspective awkward, but the intent is clear. Perhaps drawn by a slave child, or by the child of the household with a slave companion nearby. It's hard to say, but it exists, a sketch of connection. Artifacts also tell us of skilled labour. In workshops, we find tools shaped by the hands of the enslaved, metal tongs worn smooth, bone needles delicately carved, weights for looms, stamps for bread. These are the fingerprints of unrecorded artisans. In Ostia, archaeologists uncovered a laundry facility, the Phylonica. Within it, vats once used for washing clothes still contain traces of clay and lime. Slaves worked here amid the sour smell of ammonia, often barefoot stirring fabrics with wooden paddles or stomping garments in knee-high tubs. It was hot, wet, and dangerous. Yet within the grime, systems of efficiency emerged. Tools were sharpened, workflow organised, even the most gruelling labour developed patterns of skill. In private homes, objects tied to personal rituals tell us even more. Small altars with traces of ash and bone, used by slaves to honour their deities. Hairpins and amulets found near servant quarters. A carved token, possibly a keepsake or a charm for protection. These items were not grand or costly, but they held meaning. They offered control, identity, or hope in a world with few guarantees. Let us picture one such artifact, a tiny ceramic oil lamp, simple in design but carefully repaired along the handle with lead. It was not discarded when broken. Someone fixed it, perhaps because it was needed, or perhaps because it mattered. Such acts speak volumes. In one Roman latrine, a wooden writing tablet was recovered, its wax long since gone, but its impressions faintly visible. Scholars believe it may have been a message, quickly written and discarded. Was it a slave communicating a task, practicing writing, leaving a hidden thought? The ambiguity invites imagination. Clothing too tells stories. Though rare in preservation, textile remnants and frescoes help us understand how slaves dressed. Simple tunics, often unbelted, rough wool in the countryside, linen where climate or status allowed. In some depictions, domestic slaves wore a shoulder cloth or apron, marking their role. These garments were not only functional but symbolic, a uniform of servitude. In several villas, bells have been found attached to collars, used not to punish but to locate. The chime announced presence. It removed anonymity. It was a constant reminder that the wearer was not free. Yet some slaves accessorize subtly. A bronze ring, perhaps gifted, a bead threaded into hair, small touches that suggest dignity, even style. Choices made within limits. children left traces too, tiny footprints in drying clay, a scratched alphabet on a wall. As we conclude our exploration into individual stories and tangible remnants, we now turn to the broader framework that shaped them, the laws, contracts, and economic systems of Roman slavery. These are not emotional records. They are cold, calculated, bureaucratic. But through them, we can trace the contours of an enslaved life, how one was owned, used, sold, freed, and recorded. The legal status of a Roman slave was clear and absolute. Under Roman law, a slave was not a person. They were property. A thing. This legal framework governed every aspect of their existence, from the moment of purchase to the possibility of freedom. Slaves could not marry legally, though informal unions were tolerated. They could not own property, although some were permitted to manage funds or possessions in what was called a peculium, a small personal allowance granted by a master. Technically, this too belonged to the master, but in practice it allowed a measure of autonomy. Imagine a slave who saves from his peculium over years, money earned by selling wares, managing accounts, or tips from services. With careful planning and quiet discipline, he amasses enough to buy his freedom. This is not just an economic act, it is a transformation. Manumission, the act of freeing a slave, was relatively common in Roman society, especially compared to other ancient cultures. It could occur in several ways. 1. Formal manumission, manumissio vindicta, a symbolic ceremony before a magistrate where a master declared a slave free by touching them with a rod. 2. Manumissio censu, enrolling the slave in the census as a free citizen. 3. Manumissio testamento, freedom granted in a master's will, effective upon death. 4. Informal manumission, verbal declarations or symbolic gestures which held less legal security. Upon being freed, a slave became a libertus, male, or liberta, female, with specific legal rights and responsibilities. They were Roman citizens, but not full ones. Freedmen could not hold public office or serve in the army. They were still bound to their former masters, now as patroni, with obligations such as respect, loyalty, and sometimes continued service. However, the children of freed persons were born as full Roman citizens with access to all civic rights. This pathway, enslavement to freedom to full citizenship within a generation, was part of what made Roman slavery distinct. Many freedmen became economically successful. Some ran shops, worked in trades, or even amassed wealth. In inscriptions we find proud declarations. Marcus Livius, freedman of Lucius, merchant of perfumes. Others reached high status in imperial service, especially those freed by emperors, known as Liberti Augusti. They often held influential positions in the imperial household, secretaries, accountants, even administrators. Despite opportunities, stigma lingered. Freedmen were marked socially, if not legally. Their names bore the memory of slavery. Roman names followed a tripartite structure: praenomen, first name, nomen, clan, and cognomen, family branch. Freedmen adopted their former master's nomen, linking them forever to that household. For example, Publius Licinius Tiro equals Tiro, freed by Publius Licinius. This name honoured the patron, but also marked the freedman as formerly owned. It was a badge of gratitude and of history. Economically, slaves were assets. They were listed in wills, sold in markets, leased out for labour. The aediles, magistrates responsible for market regulation, monitored slave sales to ensure accurate labelling. Sellers had to declare health status, behaviour and origin. Some labels were cruelly specific: runaway prone, has been whipped, from Gaul. slaves sold with such warnings often fetched lower prices. Youth, health, and skills raised value. Female slaves of childbearing age sadly were priced not only for labour, but for reproductive potential. In estate records, slaves were listed alongside cattle and tools. Yet within these inventories, we find traces of individuality. Names appear: Daphnis, Livia, Marius. Sometimes their roles: baker, bath attendant, goat herder. Each line a life condensed to a function. Legal texts, such as the Digest of Justinian, compiled centuries later, preserve rulings on slave-related disputes. These include injuries to slaves by outsiders, compensation owed to owners, contracts entered by slaves on behalf of masters, inheritance rights involving slaves as estate property. Though technical, these rulings reveal daily realities. Slaves were trusted with transactions, managed assets, and were integral to the household economy. Punishment was also codified. Masters had the legal right to discipline their slaves, though laws gradually imposed limits. Under Emperor Hadrian, for instance, extreme cruelty, especially killing a slave without cause, was discouraged. As we move deeper into the quiet rhythms of ancient Roman life, we arrive at a place of ambiguity, where history meets mystery, where artifacts hint at meanings not fully explained. In this segment, we explore the symbolic and cultural dimensions of Roman slavery alongside archaeological puzzles that invite us to imagine rather than know. This is not the domain of law or economy, but of ritual, taboo, silence, and the quiet murmur of belief. Slavery in Rome was not only a system of labour, it was woven into religion, mythology, and cultural ritual. Some ceremonies, roles, and traditions relied upon enslaved people not simply as workers, but as figures of symbolic meaning. Their status carried weight not just in the eyes of the state, but in the eyes of the divine. Let us begin with the Saturnalia, a winter festival dedicated to Saturn, god of time and dissolution. This celebration, held in December, was characterized by role reversals. Masters served meals to slaves. The social order was upended, at least in appearance. Slaves were permitted to speak freely, even mockingly, and the usual rules were suspended. It is tempting to view Saturnalia as a moment of liberation, but it was more of a ritual inversion, a temporary symbolic chaos meant to reaffirm the structure it appeared to challenge. The laughter, the role play, the illusion of equality, all underscored the return to normalcy when the festival ended. Still, for many slaves, Saturnalia offered a rare exhale, a time to sit rather than serve, to speak rather than bow. In that liminal space, some found fragments of joy. Elsewhere in Roman ritual, slaves appeared in sacrifice and ceremony, not as victims, but as participants. In Lectisternia, banquets for the gods, household slaves prepared the divine feast, laid out sacred cushions and handled votive offerings. They moved through sacred space, often in silence, bearing the weight of unseen worlds. In some processions, slaves carried ritual objects: torches, laurel branches, silver platters. Their movements were choreographed, their gestures rehearsed. They became part of a theatre of belief, both central and invisible. Mythology, too, reflected the presence of the enslaved. Roman tales often included servile figures, nurses, companions, trusted aides. In the story of Andromeda, her attendants mourn her fate. In tales of Odysseus, even after return, household slaves provide essential recognition. These characters rarely speak much, but they act, they know, they endure. Certain religious roles were even filled by former slaves. The Augustales, priests who worshipped the deified emperors, were often drawn from the ranks of freedmen. Though barred from traditional priesthoods, they held ceremonial authority in imperial cults. Their white togas and processional duties granted a form of prestige, if not full respectability. Funerary customs provide another lens into symbolism. In some elite tombs, slaves are depicted in relief, holding torches or scrolls, guiding the deceased into the afterlife. These images suggest continuity, slavery carried into eternity, not as cruelty, but as cultural expectation. Yet not all such images are respectful. Some reliefs, especially those on sarcophagi or mosaics, depict slaves in exaggerated poses, bent, burdened, caricatured. These reflect not affection, but hierarchy preserved in stone. Archaeology uncovers even stranger fragments. At a villa near Pompeii, a small shrine known as a lararium included statues of household gods, alongside a miniature figure of a kneeling man in chains. Was this meant to represent an enslaved ancestor? A warning, a symbol of humility? Scholars debate. In the same household, graffiti in a side corridor reads, "Follicular, faithful and silent." A name, a descriptor, nothing more, but perhaps everything. The quiet presence of someone who moved through the home unseen, yet remembered. Roman burial practices for slaves varied widely. Some were buried alongside their masters, with modest markers. Others shared common graves, unnamed. Occasionally skeletons found in such graves show signs of hard labour, stressed joints, broken bones, malnutrition. Yet grave goods sometimes appear: a bead necklace, a coin for the ferryman, a small oil lamp. These items suggest ritual, care. Even if the names are lost, the gestures remain. Consider the so-called skeletons of the vineyard, found outside Pompeii. Two figures, close in death, one bearing a key. Some suggest they were slaves, left behind to guard their master's estate. The key, possibly to the storeroom, a symbol of trust or burden. The truth is unknowable, but the image remains. Cultural taboos also shaped slave life. For instance, it was considered deeply shameful for a citizen to be mistaken for a slave, hence the importance of dress, posture, and bearing. Slaves, in turn, were expected to blend into their role. Let us now turn our gaze from the solemn mysteries of religion and burial to another realm where enslaved Romans left traces of their identity: art, performance, and creativity. Within the sprawling empire, culture was not only shaped by emperors and poets, it was also touched, carried, and transmitted by those in bondage. Across the Roman world, slaves were deeply embedded in the production of art. They carved statues, laid mosaics, painted walls, stitched garments, and played music. Though they are rarely credited by name, their skill survives in the very texture of Roman beauty. They were not merely labourers, but artisans, creators working under constraint. Imagine a grand mosaic floor in a seaside villa. Its tiles, small, square, precisely cut, form a vibrant image of Neptune rising from the sea. Around him, dolphins arc through stylized waves. We do not know who placed each tessera, but it was likely a team of skilled slaves under the guidance of a master artisan. The slaves mixed lime, cut stones, arranged designs. In their hands the gods came to life. In Pompeii, the remains of a workshop show rows of pigments: red ochre, yellow sulphur, green earth. On one wall, a faint sketch in charcoal, a man's face in profile. Was it practice? A moment of freedom? A silent joke among apprentices? These faint lines carry imagination. Slaves also performed. Roman theatres, both public and private, often included enslaved actors, dancers, and musicians. Theatrical troupes sometimes travelled from city to city, with slaves playing comic roles, singing interludes, or miming in silent dramas. Their gestures were precise, their expressions trained. A slave could not speak freely. but in performance they spoke as others. In elite homes, slaves played lyres during banquets, recited poetry, or read aloud from scrolls. These roles required education, rhythm and memory, a reader's tone, a musician's timing. These subtle elements shaped how the household experienced art. Inscriptions occasionally honour these contributions. One tombstone from Ostia reads, "To Euphrosyne, flute player of grace and talent, servant of the household, beloved in life and in music." Another, more modest, simply says, "To Lucius, reader and singer." His voice brought peace. Within the sphere of craftsmanship, enslaved individuals worked in potteries, metal shops, textile houses and glassworks. They developed specialties. A smith knew how to temper iron just so. A potter understood the precise spin of the wheel. Some signed their work with a mark, an animal, a symbol, a single letter, not always allowed, but sometimes permitted. A clay oil lamp bears the stamp of a crescent moon, likely the maker's chosen sign. Found in a villa's servant quarters, it glows with utility, but also with identity. Roman fashion too was shaped by enslaved hands. Domestic slaves wove linen, dyed wool, stitched sandals. Wealthy Roman women often relied on enslaved dressers, experts in hair braiding, jewellery arrangement, fabric layering. These stylists held knowledge passed down through generations. Their work was creative, tactile and deeply personal. A wall painting in Herculaneum shows a woman seated before a mirror, a slave behind her weaving a braid. The gesture is tender, almost sisterly, yet unbalanced. One holds power, the other scissors. In elite households, some slaves became informal historians, keepers of household memory. They maintained family records, organised letters, arranged scrolls. These roles were vital. They required trust, discretion, and a careful hand. Even culinary arts bore the mark of slaves. Roman cuisine was complex, blending flavours from across the empire. Enslaved cooks adapted, innovated, and recreated dishes to suit changing palates. A sauce altered slightly, a new herb tried. The kitchen was a place of pressure, but also of invention. In one letter, Cicero praises his cook's skill in preparing lampreys. The name is lost, but the praise remains. Some enslaved individuals created tools and instruments, a bronze compass, a bone flute, a glass perfume bottle. These objects combine utility and beauty. They reflect knowledge of materials, of process, of design. In libraries, scribes, many enslaved, copied manuscripts. Their handwriting preserved the thoughts of philosophers, poets, statesmen. They worked in silence, under candlelight, with care. A hesitation, a blot, a tiny flourish, all bear human touch. Imagine a slave scribe in the early hours, bent over parchment, ink pooling in a carved groove. His task is not to create, but to replicate. Yet in the curve of a letter, he leaves himself. In some rare cases, enslaved artists became known. One fresco from Pompeii is signed, "Alexander, slave of Aulus, painted this." The name survives not as a master, but as a servant who coloured walls with beauty. Theatre provides another complex space. Roman comedies often relied on stock characters, the cunning slave. Now we turn to a subject that floats on the edge of the record, neither fully seen nor fully erased. The quiet, persistent presence of resistance among Roman slaves. Not the epic, bloody uprising of cinematic fame, but the soft resistance of daily life. The subtle push against a world of ownership. The whispered refusal to become invisible. Rome knew rebellion. And yet most slave resistance did not take the form of armies or revolts. It emerged instead in careful silences, secret exchanges and decisions made under risk. In this part of our story, we'll walk softly into those spaces, but first, the loudest rebellion. The most well-known slave uprising in Roman history is the revolt led by Spartacus. A gladiator by training, Spartacus began his rebellion in 73 BCE in the gladiatorial school at Capua. With a group of about 70 followers, he escaped, defeated small Roman forces, and gathered thousands of enslaved people to his cause. The rebellion lasted nearly 2 years. At its height, it included perhaps 60,000 men, women, and children. The Roman Senate, embarrassed and alarmed, sent multiple armies to crush it. Spartacus proved brilliant, resourceful, strategic, charismatic. But ultimately, the might of Rome overwhelmed him. He died in battle in 71 BCE. The roads to Rome were lined with crucified prisoners as a warning. A brutal silence followed. But Spartacus was not alone in rebellion. Earlier, in the 2nd century BCE, there had been 2 major uprisings in Sicily, the First and Second Servile Wars. These began with small groups of agricultural slaves, mostly in vast rural estates. Harsh treatment, overcrowding, and hunger drove them to rise up, organise, and challenge authority. In both cases, they seized weapons, elected leaders, and held territory. But as before, Rome responded with force. The rebellions were eventually crushed, the survivors punished severely. Yet these were extraordinary cases. Most resistance was quieter. One common form was flight. Escaping slavery was extremely dangerous. Harbouring a runaway was a crime, and the Roman countryside was filled with patrols, informants, and harsh geography. Still, runaways existed. Advertisements etched into stone or written on papyri tell their stories indirectly. Missing, Tiro, of short height, curly hair, scar on left arm, reward offered. Another reads, runaway, Myro, age 18, singer. May answer to another name, do not trust her. These brief notices reveal much: physical descriptions, professions, the fear of deception. They reflect both the ubiquity of escape and the paranoia it inspired. Some slaves ran to cities, blending in as free persons. Others joined bandit groups, particularly in rougher terrains. A few may have reached sanctuary among sympathetic communities. A very rare few succeeded permanently. Rebellion could also take symbolic form. A slave might work slowly, mishandle tools, feign illness. Not enough to invite punishment, but enough to delay, to remind their master of their will. These acts, often called everyday resistance, have no formal record, yet they happened in kitchens, in fields, in workshops. Even language became a tool. Slaves from diverse regions often shared multiple tongues: Latin, Greek, Thracian, Syriac, and others. Using a native dialect among themselves, especially when forbidden, was a subtle assertion of identity. Humour too could resist. Jokes at the master's expense, mimicked gestures, mock rituals, laughter behind closed doors, irreverent songs shared in private. These acts reclaimed dignity. Letters and documents hint at emotional resistance. In one preserved tablet, a slave writes, "I long for the hills. My hands remember freedom." Who this person was we do not know, but the words resist erasure. Some resistance was familial, keeping families together despite threat, hiding children, teaching them old songs, passing down names not recorded by masters. Even in separation, bonds endured. Manumission could also be an act of resistance, not just granted by masters, but bought by slaves who saved their peculium over time. This accumulation of coins, bits of silver or copper, represented more than money. It was a path carved quietly through control. Inscriptions by freedmen often declare status with pride. Felix, once a slave, now free, built this with his own hands. These are not mere biographies. They are monuments of endurance. Some slaves resisted by preserving culture, religious rituals from home, languages, burial practices, body adornment. A tattoo remembered a river god from Nubia. A woven pattern echoed Iberian hills. In gesture, song, and prayer they said, "We are more than what you see." Occasionally, even in death, resistance appeared. In a tomb near Naples, a grave marker reads, "Tudema," freed by none but time. The words are sparse, but they reject ownership. One extraordinary story comes from Delos, a major slave market. In the final part of this segment, we shift our view upward, toward the elite, toward the patricians, the senators, the wealthy merchants and landed families whose lives of luxury were supported, sustained and shaped by the invisible hands of the enslaved. This is not to shift sympathy, but to complete the picture. Understanding the upper echelons of Roman society reveals the stark contrasts and dependencies that defined it. To walk into a Roman villa was to enter a world curated by power. Floors inlaid with coloured stones, walls washed in deep reds and vibrant golds, gardens blooming with myrtle, laurel and rose, fountains murmuring under marble statues. Every detail whispered wealth, and beneath each detail was labour. Hours of washing, polishing, pruning and arranging. The elite Roman lived a life carefully buffered from hardship. Morning began with the slave-drawn curtains pulled gently aside. Water poured over hands, clothes laid out by attendants, a meal of honeyed figs, olives, fresh bread, each prepared by someone else. The elite body was rarely alone. A master might walk through his atrium, observing the morning's work, the floors swept, the lamps filled, the bronze polished. Slaves stood nearby, silent, poised, waiting. Each gesture was a performance. Each failure, however slight, might be punished. While masters viewed their villas as private realms, these spaces were never truly private. The enslaved were everywhere. They folded laundry in the courtyards. They tended the library scrolls. They stood by the doors, bowed at entrances, whispered announcements. Their presence was constant, but their personhood denied. The elite man's day often included business, conducted in the tablinum, a semi-public room where clients, freedmen and dependents gathered. Slaves fetched documents, brought refreshments, escorted visitors. A trusted secretary might manage correspondence, reading letters aloud and drafting replies. The master spoke, the slave listened. But sometimes, beneath the words, advice was exchanged. Lunch might be informal, or it might be a performance. Dining rooms, triclinia, were adorned with frescoes, banquets, gods, landscapes. Reclining couches were arranged in threes. Slaves served food in stages, pouring wine, playing music. Each course, dormice with honey, peppered lentils, roast fish, was an orchestration. A spilled cup, a misstepped sequence could shift the mood. The elite valued presentation. Even cruelty was measured. A master's control rested not just in wealth, but in calm. Yet behind closed doors, rages erupted. Discipline varied, from detached indifference to intimate violence. Some masters prided themselves on mercy. Others ruled with calculation. A few wrote of affection for particular slaves, especially childhood nurses or beloved attendants. These affections existed alongside ownership. Women of the elite had their own performances. Roman matrons rarely appeared in public alone. Their worlds were orchestrated behind high walls. Enslaved women dressed them, styled their hair, prepared their cosmetics. These roles required skill and discretion. A misplaced brooch, a burned hem, a secret overheard, each held consequence. Elite children, too, grew up surrounded. Nurses, tutors, body slaves. They learned to speak under the care of slaves, to walk, to read. Their earliest attachments were often to those they did not own, but who were owned. For some, this bred loyalty. For others, entitlement. In letters and literature, elite Romans spoke of their slaves in various tones. Some praised loyalty, others complained of laziness or treachery. Rarely did they imagine what it meant to be enslaved. The slave was a mirror, a reflection of the master's discipline, character, and status. A well-behaved household was proof of elite virtue. Ownership extended beyond the home. Elite Romans owned land, and with it, agricultural slaves. These estates, latifundia, were managed remotely. Overseers sent reports. Yields were measured. Slaves toiled unseen in the sun, while the master counted profit. The distance made cruelty abstract. Losses were tallied in columns. Entertainment reflected these dynamics. Gladiators, many enslaved, fought for elite amusement. Charioteers, actors, exotic dancers. Their lives were short, their performances grand. The elite sponsored games to win favour, demonstrating generosity while commanding obedience. At festivals, the elite processed with slaves bearing torches, instruments, offerings. Even piety was performed with help. In triumphs, enslaved captives walked behind generals, symbols of Rome's might. The line between labour and spectacle blurred. Some elite Romans freed slaves as acts of benevolence. Manumission increased loyalty, reinforced hierarchy, and showcased virtue. Freedmen often remained tied to the household, their achievements credited to their patron. A master's generosity was another form of control. As the Roman Empire expanded across continents and generations, its society grew increasingly stratified, layered, hierarchical, and carefully coded by status, wealth, birth, and role. In this segment, we'll slowly unfold the contrasts in daily life between the enslaved and the free, the poor and the privileged, the urban dweller and the rural labourer. It is within these contrasts that the shape of Roman life becomes clearest, not as a single narrative, but as a tapestry stretched taut between extremes. To live in Rome was not the same as to live in the Roman world. A senator in the capital experienced a different reality than a shepherd's daughter in Gaul or a weaver's apprentice in Alexandria. Yet wherever one went, slavery was present. It existed alongside freedom, not beneath it, casting long shadows across every level of society. Let us begin at the centre, Rome itself. The capital was vast and layered, home to emperors and artisans, soldiers and slaves. Its streets bustled with traffic, colour and sound. Markets spilled into alleys, temples loomed beside taverns, and in every corner contrast was visible. The elite lived in domus, urban mansions with private courtyards, elaborate mosaics and controlled light. Their homes were structured to display wealth and authority. Atriums framed the sky. Impluviums caught rain in stone basins. Guests were welcomed with curated grandeur. Just beyond the atrium, in the peristelium, gardens bloomed in geometric order. Statues stood among trimmed hedges. Fountains murmured gently. But behind the garden walls, hidden corridors led to slave quarters, narrow, dim, and functional. Here, servants slept in shifts, rose before dawn, and navigated the household in silence. In contrast, the urban poor lived in insulae, multi-storey apartment buildings made of wood, brick, and plaster. These structures, often crowded and unsafe, housed labourers, artisans, and freedmen. A family might live in one room, sharing walls with strangers. Cooking was done over small hearths, often in shared courtyards. There were no private gardens here, no mosaics. Light came from windows high above the street, and the scent of cooking mingled with refuse. Yet these spaces held life. Children played in stairwells, neighbours exchanged goods, songs echoed down narrow alleys, slaves moved through both worlds. Some served the wealthy, others were leased to artisans, assisting in shops and workshops. Still others worked in public spaces, cleaning streets, maintaining aqueducts, carrying water. A Roman citizen, even one without wealth, held rights denied to slaves. They could vote, marry legally, own property, and seek redress in court. Their children inherited citizenship. Their names appeared in public records. A slave, by contrast, had no legal personhood. Yet in practice the boundary blurred. A favoured slave might eat better than a free beggar. A skilled slave might earn more than a poor labourer. And yet, at any moment, they could be sold, beaten, or silenced. Freedmen occupied a strange middle ground. Once slaves, they were now free, but still tied to their former masters. They often worked in the same professions: bakers, barbers, merchants. Many became prosperous. Their children were citizens, yet stigma clung to them, and they remained excluded from senatorial office. In rural areas, life moved to a slower rhythm. Villas dotted the countryside, surrounded by fields and orchards. Elite landowners often lived in Rome and visited only seasonally. In their absence, overseers managed estates with regimentation. Field slaves laboured from dawn until dusk. Their tasks were dictated by the seasons: ploughing, planting, harvesting, pressing olives. They lived in ergastula, barracks or workhouses, often below ground, barred and windowless. Their days were long, their food minimal. A porridge of grains, water drawn from a well, a strip of dried meat, perhaps a fig in season. Punishment was swift. Rewards were rare. Yet within these constraints rhythms formed. Cooperation, whispered jokes, the comfort of shared effort. By contrast, a rural freeholder, often poor, owned a small patch of land. They worked alongside their families, free but vulnerable. A bad harvest could ruin them. Taxes loomed, and yet they controlled their time. They chose when to rest. They chose what to plant. Women's experiences also varied sharply by class and status. A noblewoman might spend her day in leisure, writing letters, overseeing slaves, weaving fine cloth. A poor woman might rise before dawn to fetch water, grind grain and tend a street stall. A female slave could be assigned any number of roles: nurse, cleaner, cook, companion, concubine. In elite circles, reputation was tightly managed. A woman's appearance, comportment and household management were reflections of her husband's status. Freed women sometimes ran businesses. Let us now move even deeper into the lived experiences of the Roman world, not by title or legal definition, but through the rhythms of everyday life. For while status separated people, it also shaped the very texture of how they dressed, what they ate, how they spent their hours, and what pleasures or freedoms they could access. In this section, we'll gently examine the sensory contrasts, woven into clothing, shaped into meals, marked by time. Let's begin with dress. To the Roman eye, clothing was not merely for function or modesty. It was a declaration. Fabric, cut, and colour conveyed status at a glance. The Roman elite wore garments that signalled power. The toga for men, a voluminous white woolen garment reserved for citizens, and the stola for women, a long draped gown worn over a tunic. A purple stripe, called clavus, denoted senatorial or equestrian rank. Wool was common, but the wealthy sought fine linen, silk and dyed fabrics, often imported at great cost from the East. To wear a toga required space and assistance. Slaves helped drape the folds, adjust the weight, ensure cleanliness. The act of dressing was a ritual of separation, time-consuming, regal, exclusive. In contrast, the lower classes wore simpler tunics, often belted at the waist. Shoes were sandals when affordable, or bare feet in the countryside. Dyes were limited, cuts plain. A tunic stained with ash or oil said much about its wearer's labour. A frayed hem revealed more than a missing coin. It told of time past, tasks performed. For enslaved people, dress was often prescribed. Field slaves wore short tunics for freedom of movement, tied at the waist. Domestic slaves, especially in elite households, wore slightly finer garments, clean, maintained, but modest. Some bore collars with inscriptions. "I belong to Marcus. Hold me if I flee." A few wore belts or tags noting tasks or warnings. Yet even within these limits, distinctions formed. A household slave who worked indoors, who served wine or taught children, might have cleaner hands, lighter fabrics. A slave cook might smell of spices, while a stable hand carried the scent of hay and sweat. These were not fashion statements. They were unspoken signs. Clothing also indicated transitions. Freed slaves often marked their new status with a change of dress, abandoning slave collars, donning garments with new dignity. In funerary art, we sometimes see a freedman shown in a toga, a visual declaration of transformation. Now let us turn to food, the daily punctuation of life. Roman meals were divided into three: ientaculum, breakfast; prandium, lunch; and cena, dinner. For the wealthy, ientaculum might be bread dipped in honey, dates, eggs, and watered wine. Lunch was light: fruit, cold meat, olives. The main meal, cena, was the grand affair. The elite dined reclining on couches, surrounded by friends, musicians, and servants. Courses arrived in sequence: appetizers, gustatio; mains, prima mensa; desserts, secunda mensa. Dishes were elaborate: roasted game, spiced fish, stuffed dormice, honey-glazed vegetables. Sauces like garum, fermented fish, added pungency. Wines were mixed, filtered, and often infused with herbs. Slaves managed every detail: preparation, plating, serving. They moved silently, anticipating needs. A cough might summon water, a gesture, more wine. For the poor and enslaved, meals were simpler. Breakfast might be dry bread. Lunch, a handful of olives or porridge. Dinner, if substantial, included pulse, a thick-grained porridge, sometimes with legumes or greens. Meat was rare. Salted fish, cheese, or eggs were prized. The food was plain but sustaining. Yet even within scarcity there was rhythm. Bread baked in communal ovens, shared in neighbourhoods. Beans boiled slowly, sweetened with fennel. Children waiting for roasted chestnuts sold in the street. Slaves often ate separately after serving. In countryside estates, food was rationed and recorded: grain, oil, vinegar. Urban slaves might eat in the kitchen, seated on low stools. Conversation was quiet, meals brief. Time itself moved differently across status lines. For the elite, time was divided by appointments, clients, leisure, and ritual. A senator might rise at dawn, bathe, receive guests, attend court, then dine and read. Afternoons included walks, poetry, or music. Evenings brought philosophical debate or private entertainment. Time was structured but flexible. For the working poor, time was measured by labour. A baker rose before sunrise. A carpenter toiled until dusk. Days off came irregularly. Festivals offered pause, but bills continued. The rhythm was dictated by need. For slaves, time was largely owned. Wake with the master, serve his bath, prepare his meal, clean, mend, fetch. Some tasks were constant: lighting lamps at sunset, maintaining fire through the night. Others were seasonal: harvesting, preserving, clearing. As we move into the final part of this segment, we pause to examine the fragility and fluidity of social roles in the Roman world. Though society was rigidly stratified, with clear legal boundaries between slave and citizen, poor and elite, those boundaries were sometimes crossed by chance, by wealth, by service, or by ruin. Roman life, for all its order, was shaped by change. In this canvas, we reflect on that change, on how lives rose, fell, and reshaped themselves across generations, on how the boundaries that seemed fixed were, in moments, unexpectedly porous. Let us begin with war, the great reshaper. Throughout Roman history, conquest brought waves of enslaved people into the empire. After the sack of a city, captives were divided, some sent to mines, others to households, a few to the arena, their past erased, their future uncertain. Yet war also created opportunity. A soldier from a humble village could rise through ranks, earn land, and retire with status. Veterans received plots in colonies. Their sons became citizens. A father who once fought in Gaul might watch his grandchild study rhetoric in Rome. Slaves, too, sometimes found elevation. Those captured as children and educated within a household might grow into trusted aides, scribes, tutors, stewards. If manumitted, they entered the world as freedmen, often taking their former master's name. And once free, their world widened. A freedman could marry, own property, start a business. Some became bakers, craftsmen, ship owners. A few grew wealthy, though still barred from senatorial office. Their children, however, born free, could go further. One inscription tells the story. To Marcus Vibius Ampliatus, freedman, who built this tomb for his son, a citizen of Rome. Within a single lifetime, the line from bondage to civic pride was traced. Economic change also shifted roles. A merchant might rise to equestrian rank through trade. A noble might fall into debt selling land, slaves, or even titles. Patronage offered support, but also dependency. The line between wealth and ruin was thinner than marble. One elite man, once a senator, was later found managing a bathhouse. Another, a freedman, funded a public library. Luck played a role. A fisherman might find a lost purse and gain his freedom. A slave, entrusted with money, might invest wisely, buy his manumission, and start a tavern. A wealthy man might die childless and leave everything to a loyal servant. Roman law permitted these shifts. Wills could free slaves. Contracts could be negotiated. Peculium could be saved. The state imposed taxes on manumission but allowed it. Still, not all paths were upward. A free man could fall into slavery through debt, crime, or false accusation. Pirates raided coastal towns, capturing citizens. Some were sold in distant markets, never to return. The fragility of freedom was real. Even birth did not guarantee safety. A noble family might fall from favour. A scandal could exile a senator. A misjudged war might claim sons and fortune. Political tides change quickly. Today's host might be tomorrow's exile. Urban life, while full of opportunity, was also precarious. Fires, floods, disease, and collapse of buildings claimed lives. A family might rise through trade, only to fall with the market. In contrast, some enslaved individuals forged networks of influence. A steward who managed estates, a tutor who educated a governor's child, a physician who served a wealthy household. Their voices, though quiet, shaped decisions. Their knowledge became indispensable. In the imperial court, freedmen held immense power. Narcissus, Pallas, and others managed affairs of state under emperors. Though not from noble blood, their proximity to power gave them influence feared by senators. This caused tension. Old families resented the success of the newly freed. Satirists mocked their origins, even as their wealth grew. The phrase new money, novus homo, was both badge and insult. And yet Rome survived on such movement. Its bureaucracy, economy, and culture were animated not just by lineage, but by flux. In households, the internal structure also shifted. A child born into slavery might rise to favour. A trusted slave might become dispensator, managing funds. A concubine might bear a master's child, later legitimised. Inscriptions reveal such dynamics. To Livia, once a slave, now wife and mother. To Tiro, my steward, whose wisdom guided me. These are not fictions. They are memorials chiselled in stone. Marriage changed status. A freed woman who married a citizen elevated her household. A poor man who married the daughter of a merchant might join the business, rise in rank. A soldier's widow, pensioned and remarried, might own land. Social mobility, while limited, was real. But so too was collapse. A failed harvest could mean debt. A fire could destroy a shop. A disease could erase a lineage. As we enter the final segment of this journey, we return to the heart of our story, the endurance of the enslaved in the Roman world. We've wandered the halls of villas, traced footsteps through dusty streets, examined law and ritual, rebellion and routine. Now we gather all those threads to reflect more deeply on how enslaved people lived not just in labour, but in time, how they carried their identities, preserved their dignity, and found ways to endure. Endurance is not simply survival. It is the shaping of meaning amid limitation. It is the continuation of life not only through obedience or submission, but through memory, relationship, ritual, and inner rhythm. For many Roman slaves, life was lived in cycles, defined by task, season, or master's mood. The days repeated, yet within that repetition, meaning could be made. A cook might perfect a recipe, adjusting spice and texture. A cleaner might learn to move so quietly that she startled no one. A tutor might delight when a young pupil grasped a difficult phrase. These moments were not freedom, but they were human. Relationships sustained the enslaved. Though formal marriage was denied to them, many slaves formed deep bonds, romantic, parental, familial. Couples lived together, raised children, celebrated births. A mother taught her daughter how to knead dough. A father told stories in the twilight. A friend shared extra olives when rations ran low. These ties were vulnerable. A master could sell a child, separate lovers, move a family to another estate. And yet, bonds reformed. Inscriptions sometimes record reunions, siblings found again, spouses freed and rejoined. Love in all its forms was both a comfort and a risk. Naming held power. A name was given by a master, but identity could grow beyond it. A slave called Felicitas might come to embody quiet optimism. A boy named Thrax might speak often of his homeland's rivers. Even in bondage, people remembered who they had been, or imagined who they still were. Nicknames, diminutives, secret names. These circulated in kitchens, fields, and workshops. They formed intimacy. When a child called his caretaker Mama, it meant something beyond role. Memory endured in other ways, a charm hidden beneath a tunic. A tune from childhood, hummed softly while grinding grain. A carved figure tucked behind a beam. Even slaves born in Rome, generations removed from their ancestral homes, carried fragments of older worlds. Time itself was reshaped. Though a master's schedule dictated much, slaves created their own rhythms. A servant might rise before the household, not simply to prepare, but to enjoy silence. A stable hand might linger at sunset to feel the horses breathe. A nurse might rock a child beyond sleep, savouring the stillness. Ritual also grounded life. Some slaves participated in their master's religion, lighting lamps for the household gods, preparing sacrificial offerings. Others maintained personal traditions, lighting incense to Isis, whispering to Syrian spirits. pouring libations to forgotten ancestors. Religious syncretism allowed this coexistence. Rome absorbed deities, and slaves wove their prayers into that tapestry. In hidden corners, altars held both Jupiter and a river spirit from Gaul. Burial practices reveal further endurance. Inscriptions for slaves, though rare, often include expressions of affection and dignity. To Tertia, who served faithfully, whose laughter warmed our home. To Felix, who taught my son, who loved the garden, who is missed. These words, chosen by former masters, fellow slaves, or family, assert identity. They claim space in memory. Some slaves were buried with small treasures, a favourite comb, a worn charm, a coin for the journey. These were not legal legacies, but emotional ones. Work, too, could become a kind of presence. A pot thrown with care, a cloth stitched evenly, a floor swept in perfect spirals. These acts, though repetitive, left traces. Archaeologists find these imprints and feel a person behind them. Even laughter survived. Graffiti tells of jokes, complaints, love notes, satire. In a workshop, Lucia sings while she sews, badly but sweetly. Or, I am tired, but the bread is baked. That is something. These are voices speaking not to us but to one another. That we overhear them centuries later is a kind of miracle. Some slaves found pride in excellence, a mosaic completed well, a meal admired, a child protected. These were not performances for masters, but for self, for community, for continuity. Others found quiet resistance, a pause when not expected, a favour for a friend, a task done in a way that preserved strength. These were not grand rebellions, but they mattered. Endurance included sorrow. Grief moved through slave communities, mourning a friend sold, a child lost, a day too heavy. These sorrows were rarely recorded, but they lived in the silence after laughter. In this portion, we turn to particular lives, individual stories that flicker in the historical record, offering windows into the endurance and humanity of Roman slaves. Though few names survive, each fragment invites us to breathe life back into a person whose fate was written by others. First, Anicetus the gladiator. Anicetus was a Thracian youth captured in war and sold to a gladiatorial school in Capua. His name, meaning unconquerable, was likely bestowed by a Lanista, the trainer who saw potential in him. Records suggest Anicetus fought bravely in the arena, surviving dozens of bouts. He earned small gifts from the crowd, coins, a garland, the occasional cloak. Though his life was bound by sand and sword, Anicetus found meaning in the rhythm of combat, the preparation, the whispers of his peers, the drum beats preceding a match. A graffito in Pompeii reads simply, Anicetus, brave to the end. It's unclear whether this was written by a lash-scarred hand or a free citizen struck by his performance, but it remains etched in faded black paint. His story illustrates endurance in the face of spectacle. Each fight was a negotiation between life and death. His legacy, a name that echoed in cheers then faded into silence, only to re-emerge in a single line on a wall. Second Claudia, the salon cook. Claudia served in the kitchens of a wealthy Roman matron in Ostia. She was renowned for her skill in preparing gustaccio, delicate appetizers of marine snails, fresh herbs and olive oil. A letter from the mistress found among papyri praises her. Claudia's hands bring the flavours of the sea to life. Our guests marvel at her talent. Within the structured chaos of a salon dinner, Claudia's calm presence anchored the evening. She taught younger slaves, supervised the pantry, and preserved recipes passed down from her grandmother in Carthage. When she fell ill, the mistress paid for a physician, an act both merciful and strategic. Claudia's work was essential. Upon recovery, Claudia quietly resumed her duties, but her bond with the matron deepened. Though still enslaved, she gained a small allowance to buy perfumed oil. She saved coins, hoping one day to purchase freedom for herself and her daughter. Whether she succeeded, the record does not say, but her perseverance shines through crumbs of papyrus. Third, Juba the Salarius. Juba was an African slave who managed the granaries of a villa in Sicilia. Salarius was his title, keeper of grain. He oversaw massive stores of wheat, ensuring supply and preventing spoilage. His work was meticulous, measuring temperature, rotating sacks, recording yields. An inscription on a wooden tally board, preserved by chance in damp soil, reads, Juba Salarius, quarter 5, 1200 modii, good condition. This dry accounting belies the pressure he faced, droughts, rodents, inspections by magistrates. Yet Juba's notes are precise. His handwriting, though crude, is confident. He instructed younger slaves and free labourers alike, forging a team that respected his expertise. His status was anomalous, a slave with authority over resources. His legacy, numbers on wood, a testament to competence and quiet leadership. Fourth, Thala, the spinner. In a textile workshop near Ephesus, Thala, a Greek-born slave, spun fine wool into thread used for wealthy bridal garments. Her skill lay in maintaining even tension, preventing knots and matching dyes. The tapestry she helped create for a provincial governor's wedding featured intricate patterns, doves, vines, meandering meanders. Though her hands moved in repetitive loops, her mind traced stories, fragments of Homer, lullabies from childhood. The scrap of linen found in a burial pit bears her faint signature, a tiny symbol etched in the margin, perhaps a personal brand, a flower, a sunburst. Thala's endurance was woven into the fabric, literal threads of resilience. She endured long days, cold nights, and the monotony of the wheel. Yet through her craft, she left an imprint of beauty and identity. Fifth, Marcus, the librarian's slave. In Rome itself, Marcus served as scholar, organising scrolls in a private library. He read faintly, enough to categorise works, philosophy, poetry, law, medicine. His master praised him in letters. Marcus's diligence makes our work possible. Without him, texts lie buried. When the master fell ill, Marcus preserved the library's contents, relocating scrolls to safety. During a fire in the neighbourhood, he risked his life to carry a bundle of manuscripts to a neighbour's house. The master's gratitude was profound, a promise of freedom upon recovery. Whether that promise was kept is uncertain. But Marcus's endurance lay in intellectual stewardship, preserving knowledge when chaos threatened. 6. Livia, the wet nurse. Livia, of unknown origin, served as wet nurse to a noble family's infant son. Her milk was prized, her care tender. In the child's later letters, in this final stretch before our conclusion, we reflect on the lasting impressions of endurance, how the lives of the enslaved echo beyond their own time, shaping our understanding of humanity, resilience, and collective memory. Shared rhythms across time. Though separated by geography and era, the experiences of Roman slaves resonate with patterns we see in other contexts. Communities bound by work, individuals finding agency within constraint, traditions passed down in secret. Their rituals, morning prayers, shared meals, whispered songs, mirror practices in later societies where labour was unequal, yet bonds held strong. The power of memory. History often remembers rulers, wars and laws, yet the endurance of the enslaved reminds us that memory is wider. It includes the whispered names on tombstones, the scratches on walls, the songs hummed in workshops. These faint voices challenge a narrative centered on the powerful, insisting that every human life leaves a trace. Artisans of resilience, slaves shaped the physical and cultural world of Rome, carving mosaics, spinning thread, wrestling in arenas and preserving knowledge. Through their creativity and labour, they influenced aesthetics, cuisine, technology, and administration. Their craftsmanship not only sustained elite lifestyles, but also enabled the empire's expansion and cohesion. Endurance as agency. Survival under oppression is not passive. It requires negotiation, strategy, and imagination. Tiro's shorthand, Juba's records, Thala's signature, and Marcus's library rescue illustrate multiple forms of agency. These acts, incremental, often unseen, remind us that agency can thrive even in unfreedom. Fragility and hope. The stories of capture, bondage, and release reflect the fragility of human fortunes. Yet they also embody hope, the aspiration for freedom, the drive to learn, the impulse to care for others. Claudius's culinary artistry, Livia's nurturing love, and Helpis's midwifery underscore the transformative power of compassion. Legacy beyond chains. While slavery in ancient Rome was embedded in legal and economic systems, its human impact extended far beyond those structures. Freedmen shaped cities, educated citizens, funded temples, and contributed to literature. Their children, born free, helped forge new social strata. The echoes of their families persisted in Roman society for generations. A mirror for our times. Looking back at Roman slavery asks us to consider modern parallels. Systems of labour exploitation, struggles for recognition, the quiet endurance of marginalised people, the archaeology of bones, the archives of names, and the art of memory challenge us to expand our understanding of history to include voices too often silenced. A gentle reflection. As our journey draws to a close, return once more to the image of those fields at dawn, the flicker of lamps in narrow corridors, the chant of work songs and the hush of libraries. Each detail is an invitation to honour the lives beneath grand narratives, to listen for faint echoes, and to recognise endurance in our own world. The enslaved in Rome lived under constraints designed to break spirits. Yet through resilience, relationship and ritual, they crafted lives of meaning. Their stories, scattered, sparse, but stubborn, persist. And now, as you rest, let their endurance ripple through your thoughts. Their whispers are ancient, yet living. They speak of survival, dignity, care, and the unquenchable light of memory. Sleep and dream of distant voices, of bustling villas, dusty roads, hidden shrines, and everyday acts of courage. In the tapestry of history, every thread matters. And in the quiet of the past, we find connection, solace, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As our gentle journey through the world of Roman slavery comes full circle, let us pause to gather the light threads we've followed into daily toil, personal stories, legal frameworks, cultural rituals, and the quiet endurance that shaped countless lives. A journey in 20 steps. Over 20 canvases, we began with a soft invitation to explore, not in the grandeur of emperors or the glamour of conquest, but in the worn sandals and calloused hands of the enslaved. We witnessed dawn breaking over fields, heard the hush of corridors and felt the pulse of labour, ritual and personal resilience. We then traced individual lives, Tiro, who wrote history in shorthand, Faustus and Julia, whose epitaphs declared love, the cook Claudia and the granary keeper Juba, whose skills earned small honours, Marcus the librarian's aide, whose courage preserved knowledge, and many others whose names echo faintly through stone and scroll. We stepped into the realm of mystery, ritual inversions of Saturnalia, symbolic figures in Luraria, and graffiti that whispered secrets. We saw slaves as artisans, as musicians, as storytellers in theatre and workshop. And we felt the pulse of resistance. Spartacus's army, runaways bold enough to flee, workers who delayed tasks and reclaimed moments of autonomy. We contrasted the framed lives of the elite, villa, forum, banquet, with the cramped insulae and ergastula. We saw how clothing, food, and time itself articulated status. The folds of a toga, the taste of honeyed figs, the luxury of leisure, the weight of chains. And finally we returned home to endurance, to small acts of love and care, to rituals of prayer, to carved signatures on pottery, to laughter in the shadows and tears when bonds were broken. Threads of meaning. From these echoes, several truths emerge. Endurance is multifaceted. It is not mere survival, but the crafting of meaning through skill, memory, relationship, and ritual. Agency lives in details. A shorthand system, a repaired lamp, a signature in thread. These acts reveal choices made under constraint. Memory transcends silence. Names on tombstones, graffiti on walls, and preserved letters extend lives beyond chains. Contrast illuminates. Understanding. Roman society requires seeing both the highest halls and the lowest barracks. Human continuities. Ancient endurance resonates today in any context where power is unequal and dignity is quietly asserted. A soft farewell. Now, as you allow your mind to drift, let the images of Roman fields at dawn blend with the hush of your own space. Picture the slow turning of the pottery wheel, the careful folds of fabric, the soft chant of labour songs, the faint glow of a solitary lamp. Know that history is not only the story of those in power, it is woven from the lives of many, often unnamed. When you sleep, carry with you the gentle persistence of those who laboured in obscurity. Their endurance is a quiet beacon, part of a shared human tapestry. Thank you for joining this gentle exploration. May it ease your mind, broaden your understanding, and remind you of the enduring strength found in small acts of care, creativity, and memory. Good night, and rest well.